It's my pleasure to chair this session this evening and to introduce our wonderful speakers. It's lovely to welcome you along this evening and particularly to focus on Build It and They Will Play as our focus. My name's Donna Cross and I work at the Telethon Kids Institute and work with a wonderful team of people as part of the University of Western Australia and other researchers who are located with us. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Noongar land and pay our respects to the elders past and present. When you think about the built environment, lots of people think that maybe that's just the structural issues that we have around us. But even tonight, as we were chatting beforehand, Jeff and I were considering there are so many aspects of the built environment that often people don't consider. And tonight, I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about the many features of the built environment that could encourage particularly young people to play and be more active. In my notes here, Tammy's pointed out, and I love this point, that the great Aussie dream of living on a quarter acre, of course, is not what we currently have, which means that our communities have changed so much from having a local corner store that we could walk to and perhaps facilities and play areas in our own home that we don't currently have. So it's obviously important that we consider how dependent we've become on cars and the ways that we can design our environment so that children have the opportunity to play and be healthy. And of course, making our environments, urban environments in particular, more appropriate to improve the ability of children to play and at the same time increase their physical activity and their health and mental well-being as part of that. But to tell us more about this, because I'm not the expert, three of Australia's leading experts in the built environment area and health. First up tonight is Professor Stuart Trost from the Institute, and Stuart is the closest to me here, from the Institute of Health and Biomedical Innovation at Queensland University of Technology. And Stuart's research interests include community-based interventions to promote physical activity in children and youth. And Stuart headed up the scientific committee responsible for drafting children's physical activity recommendations for Australian youth as a member of the scientific committee for drafting physical activity and screen time recommendations for Australian children under 5, and was also a member of a panel to establish evidence-based guidelines for physical activity in school-aged youth in the United States. So wonderful expertise. And Stuart will be followed by Assistant Professor Hayley Christian, who many of you would know from the Telethon Kids Institute and the Centre for the Built Environment at the University of Western Australia. And of course, many of you would know of Hayley's wonderful research background in the NHMRC fellowship that she also holds. But the notes here also asked me to mention that Hayley's obviously very interested and conducts some wonderful research looking at the built environment and how that shapes children's physical activity. And her research involves developing, evaluating and translating strategies for increased physical activity, health and wellbeing in adults and children through the built environment and the interventions that she's designed. She's currently leading a pilot project looking at the activity levels of preschoolers when they're attending daycare. And our final speaker tonight is Adjunct Associate Professor Jeff Woolcott from the Wesley Mission Brisbane and Griffith University School of Human Services and Social Work. And Jeff is an experienced social researcher with expertise, considerable expertise in social and community service planning and evaluation. Jeff is a frequent public speaker about bettering the built and natural environments for children and youth, using a whole-of-community approach and also using community wellbeing indicators to help drive local community development. And he's also an Aussie football coach and needs to get back to Queensland in a hurry because his team needs him for the finals, is it? Jeff? Yeah, so impressive coach, clearly, if you've got the boys to the finals. So would you please join me in welcoming Stuart to kick off our presentation this evening. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a great honour to be here in Western Australia and to speak at this really wonderful event. I'm really pleased that such a progressive and really enlightened approach to promoting physical activity in young people. My task tonight is really to set the scene about how much activity one should do and how much screen time your children should have, and some of the evidence behind that, and a little bit about what schools and what parents can do to help them meet these guidelines. So we start off with a very simple model. Little academics, you know, we'd like to have simple models to follow. And this one really, even though it's simple, informed some of the guidelines that we've written for children and adolescents. And we're going to talk a little bit about, if I get this pointer right here, the obvious one here between what health benefits accrue from being physically active as a child. So we'll talk a lot about the immediate health outcomes, but I'm sure a lot of us are interested in what is the long-term effects of being physically active as a child? Are there long-term health benefits? Is there so-called immunisation? If I'm physically active, will I prevent chronic disease later in life? So I'm going to talk about this line, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about, about these two vertical lines. And what's important is that we get kids to enjoy physical activity, to develop it as a lifestyle or a habit, if you will, so that it persists into adulthood. And a lot of things where we talk about getting kids outside, getting a love of being outdoors, engaging in fun and activities, getting proficiency in motor skills so they can engage in sport. This is all about getting that tracking of physical activity going down this line here. We also know that some of the things like overweight and obesity, even insulin levels, even blood pressure, and to some extent cholesterol levels, they also track or maintain a consistent level from childhood into adolescence, into adulthood. So we can make a big difference to those levels and get them down during childhood through a healthy, active lifestyle. Well, then they will continue perhaps to track at low levels. And in that way, we can get children's activity to confer a long-term health benefit later on. And we don't have time to talk about the massive health economic tsunami that is potentially rolling towards our shores if we continue with overweight and obesity and diabetes, etc. Just lastly, is there a direct effect? It probably is not a direct effect, or at least of evidence, but we are always doing studies, really learning things about epigenetics and about biomarkers, and perhaps one day we will see that there is a really direct effect of something that's changed in our childhood that has a long-term and lasting effect on activity. So with that, when we did the guidelines or updated the guidelines just recently, we have a plethora of really impressive health benefits. So if you, well, why should I be physically active? Well, there's quite a few reasons, and I've broken this table down by the evidence, and we definitely have an evidence-based approach. So we're really looking for strong evidence, level 1 evidence, which is really research that comes from carefully controlled, carefully designed studies with control groups or randomized controlled trials. And this is the best possible evidence that we can take and recommend physical activity. And you can see that cardiometabolic health, or what is all that? We can talk about body fatness or adiposity. We can talk about insulin levels, blood glucose levels, cholesterol, those types of things. Even in childhood, physical activity is associated with healthier levels of those factors. Bone health, muscular health. One of the biggest things that from the first guidelines that we saw was an impressive array of evidence linking regular physical activity to stronger bones and better strength, endurance, musculoskeletal issues that are prevented. So, low back pain, even those types of things. Some of the other ones that are interesting is the emerging evidence linking regular physical activity to cognitive functioning and academic performance. And this is a really impressive growing body of evidence that has strong biological plausibility in that quite consistent aerobic exercise not only affects your heart health, but also has a great effect on your brain. And that it gives you more blood flow in your brain, it creates more blood vessels in your brain, it creates more synapses. There's a really generally positive effect on brain health. And this translates perhaps into better academic functioning, better concentration, better executive function, which can mean doing better at school. So that was an important event. So we see somewhat a mix of evidence probably in the older age groups, but by and large there's a fairly compelling argument, if you didn't need one already, to say that you should engage in physical activity for health. So what are the guidelines? We've broken them down into children and, or we might call them young people or adolescents, and we've maintained the original guideline, which calls for at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity on a daily basis. And what do I mean by moderate to vigorous? Well, you could think of that as brisk walking, should be comfortable type of activity. So that's a good way of thinking about it. If you're, strolling while you're shopping or whatever, that probably is not moderate activity. But as I'll mention later, that still has some really powerful health effects as well. As I mentioned, we've updated the guidelines to really recognise the importance of having some vigorous physical activity as in part of that package, as well as activity that promotes bone health or strength promoting as well. So these are basically, if you engage in a wide variety of developmentally appropriate activities, engage in some sport, do some active play, go play in the backyard with your parents, those types of things, you're probably going to get those mix of activities. Probably not a great idea just to, just swim 24 hours, a day, or just do one sport perhaps, because it may not get some benefits in other areas. But still, a broad variety of activities will probably get all these things. Now, one of the newer developments was some recommendations on the screen time, and we've adopted the reducing it to 2 hours or so a day. And so 5 to 12-year-olds should minimise the time they spend to just 2 hours. And one of the key areas here is really this idea of breaking up sedentary time. So this, although not as strong evidence as adults, we've found that regardless of how much physical activity you do, if you do prolonged sitting, that has a deleterious effect on things like cardiometabolic health, etc. So it's always a good idea to break up sitting, and we've seen the advent of the standing desk at works, and we're starting to see those in schools as well. Thinking about just different ways to keep on the move, and so that's an important new aspect that we're thinking about. Essentially the same guidelines for 13 to 17-year-olds, but naturally they will meet these guidelines in an entirely different way to a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. So we see a shift from key, developmentally appropriate that probably has more of a focus on maybe acquisition of motor skill development, etc., to more of an adult model where engaging in fitness promoting activities and more of an adult model, if you will. Young people's sedentary guidelines are also the same. And I do laugh because they are my children on the left there. So it's a couple of years ago, but it is a struggle to keep your kids from doing too much sitting and too much screen time. And it's a real challenge for us to monitor this idea of screen time because, as I was mentioning yesterday, I may be in front of a screen in some form for maybe 15 hours a day. So it'd be a 24-hour day if I took my phone to bed, which I'm not allowed to do. And I don't recommend that you do either. So breaking up as long as possible. Now, we do think it's important to get them started early in life, and we've developed guidelines for kids under 5. And so the current guidelines are broken down into infants, toddlers and preschoolers. And right from the start, and that's often the names of these types of rollouts, is that we encourage tummy time and engaging in social interaction with parents and caregivers, and not to sort of, confine children to car seats for 4 hours a day, or things that there's lots of cute toys to play with, but they can't move. Those types of saucer devices, etc. So a bit of tummy time. Our toddlers in preschool should be active now. Note for 3 hours every day, and 3 hours, but that is a little bit different in that it's all basically movement of any kind. So we're not going moderate and above. We're saying, even from standing up to doing some moving is engaging in activity, and we want them to accumulate that activity every day for 3 hours. So it doesn't all have to come at once, but it's a 3-hour recommendation. In our screen time, we've basically recommended that should only be limited to 1 hour a day in 2 to 5-year-olds, and then a complete absence of screen time in younger children. And this is based on a lot of evidence, not even related to the idea, sort of cardiovascular health risk factors, but a whole raft of social and important child development outcomes relying on social interaction. How are we doing? Are we meeting these guidelines? Well, this is some information that was published in a report fairly recently released as part of a global undertaking where we are essentially giving countries a report card on how they're doing. And for physical activity, Australia did not do well. We failed and got D- for physical activity. Why is that? Well, if you look at the data, less than 20% of kids 5 to 17 meet the 60-minute guideline every day. So, there's 4 out of 5 kids who are not meeting the guideline. So we do have a bit of an activity crisis there. And if we look at it another way, only 4 days of the week on average do kids meet 60 minutes of MVPA. Only 17% accumulate 12,000 steps. Many of you probably use a pedometer every day, and while 10,000 steps is often thought of as the goal, for children, that's because they take a lot more steps, right? Actually, the goal is about 12,000. 12,000 comes from a study which we sort of calibrated or worked out how many steps are associated with 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Now, for the preschoolers, depends if you're half empty or half full here. So the 72% of Australians report that their 2 to 4-year-olds meet the 3-hour recommendation, and that they do so on average about 6 out of every 7 days of the week. And so we have to think about the methodology, and when we call parents and say, well, was your 2 to 4-year-old fairly active today? And they say, oh yeah, they're very active, I can't keep up with them. But when we actually put a little device on them, like an accelerometer or a motion sensor, like in this is data from a fairly large Victorian sample, Trina Hinckley's work, about 5% of preschool children meet the 180 minutes of activity a day. So when we objectively measure it, if we reduce that to 2 hours a day, it gets around 56%. We see gender differences emerging there as well. So now, I'm not saying one's wrong, one's right, but somewhere in between is the truth perhaps, but it's probably that a substantial number of kids under 5 aren't meeting those guidelines. And if we think about self-report and the limitations, and I'm a parent, I don't see my kids at school every day and know what they're doing. So there's some real limitations of getting parents to report that, especially when it's something they think is, they feel maybe embarrassed if my children do no activity, they watch 10 hours a day of television. They won't necessarily confess that to you. What can we do about it? So we're here to talk about the built environment, and of course this is critical in this what we call a social ecological approach, where we really focus on all the multiple levels and the multiple influences that could influence a behaviour like physical activity and screen time. So we're not just interested in how people think and just the individual level kind of thoughts and cognitions, but we're very interested in the interplay between how people and built environments and then the whole policy arena, community structures, etc., all have influence in a sort of a bi-directional approach. And so one of the key ones, of course, here are some just examples, of course, your individual factors of how confident you feel about doing activity, whether you feeling good about it, how your friends or your parents or your peers influence that. What happens at your school is an example of institutional factor. Then a lot of what we would think of traditional built environmental things like, whether there are places to walk, destinations to walk to, whether it's safe, those types of things. And as well as the public policy in terms of, do we give tax breaks for, having communities that have walkable bike paths, etc. And all these things have some evidence of being linking and promoting physical activity. We really want to talk to the parents in the room today, and some of us are all parents and researchers, but one of the key interpersonal is really what can the influence of parents, and parents really have a really tremendous influence on kids' physical activity, as you would suspect. It's almost like a gatekeeper role, particularly in the younger children. And we've done some work in this area, and just sort of thinking about our systematic review that we did quite a while ago now, but we looked at really the things that have been studied is, well, do active parents result in active children? Parental support. By parental support, we talk about the things that you do to support your child's activity. You sign them up, you drive them to places, you play with them, you encourage them, you tell them, I love you because you're active today. Those types of things are all ways of doing parental support. Some other things are parenting style. If I tell my child to get outside and play, versus, hey, you know what, you've been watching TV a lot, why don't you, go out and get some fresh air, get some activity? That's sort of doing the same thing, but a completely different parenting style. And it's important, not just what we do, but how we do it. And that sort of encourages the kids to have self-regulation and some, values about doing activity. And we've looked at some things about families, like whether they're cohesive as well. Just going to focus on the parental support, all the different types of support there. But the bottom line here is that the vast majority of studies done in this area consistently report a very positive relationship in that parents who provide the support have more physically active kids. And we hear a lot about being a good role model, right? So it's like, oh, you have to be a great role model. And when we looked at parent activity and parent and child activity, when we control or take into account parental support, we actually don't find a relationship. So if you think about this picture here, tries to illustrate the story here. So this, we have a very active parent. In fact, I got this parent is training for a marathon. He still does about 2 or 3 hours a day on the treadmill here. But in the meantime, the kids not exactly doing anything on the physically active side of things. So this is a great example of, if I'm measuring the parent's activity and measuring the child's activity, it's not going to be correlated. The fact is that this mum probably really likes physical activity and does the things that she needs to do to make sure her kids get physical activity. So she's going to take them to the park later on. She's going to sign them up for soccer or whatever the case may be. I'm going to conclude with what things have support from evaluations and evidence about how we can improve physical activity levels. And this is a panel that I served on where academics like to do reviews. Well, we also like to review the reviews. I haven't seen a review of the review of the reviews yet, but I'm sure we're getting there one day. But so when there's a lot of studies on there, we like to look at the evidence. And these are sort of the current state of play here. What can we say? Do we have any physical educators in the audience? No? Okay. Well, it makes sense that school physical education has a great role in promoting physical activity. And when we actually implement it as it's supposed to be, or change it so that it does deliver, provides physical activity and promotes the skills to enhance physical activity down the road, it does what it's intended to do. So there's strong evidence there. Active transportation, that's something probably dear to quite a few in the room. Not quite over the line yet, but certainly suggestive evidence. So we have a little mix there, but in emerging, not enough studies perhaps, but things like walking and biking to school, those types of events, those programs that foster greater skills in those areas as well, that some evidence there. Another emerging area is the activity break. These are the 5-minute, 10-minute breaks that you can infuse during the school day to break it up sitting time and maybe to learn something about maths or science as well. So these are little activity breaks that can have a profound effect actually even on BMI as well as academic function or grades at school. School physical environment and after-school programs, there's not enough evidence to support those yet. And we have been very unsuccessful in changing parenting behaviour around physical activity. So even though I just said it's very important, we haven't found a way for the parents who have so many things on their plate to really take this on and change what they're currently doing if they're not providing those opportunities. And it makes sense that if we put all the things that work together in a multi-component, that it all works. So that's good. But difficult to do when resources are scarce and money is tight. So I'm just going to finish off with an analysis that sort of takes an economic approach to it. And it did a systematic review of all the interventions or programs that were tested for effectiveness, and they used an objective measure, and they found out, well, how effective was this program at increasing physical activity? And they did some maths, and they came up to a way of calculating the number of minutes extra of moderate to vigorous physical activity a child would receive if they were to be part of this program. And you can see that, that if you did, now mandatory PE is maybe a term that, doesn't sound too hot, but this is daily physical education. So quality PE on a daily basis, if your child was exposed to that, they would get an extra 23 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. They're 1/3 of the way there. But if you also had walking and biking to school, you can add on another 16 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. If they were modified playgrounds, maybe there was some markings on the ground or, those types of things, that's another 6 minutes. So I find that this is a really good way to communicate how to policymakers and educators of the values of these programs. Like, if you do this, you can add another 23 minutes a day. So you can see that parks and renovated, which is another very important aspect here. The grass area with the sole little spring little bunny rabbit on there or whatever that you have, that's not very interesting. If you renovate that park to have amenities, 12 minutes there. So some take-home messages. So we do have a problem. We need to get more kids physically active. We're not doing well. We have a lot of kids in Australia not meeting the guidelines, and we're not really heading in a positive direction with, maybe schools, taking away opportunities for physical activity rather than enhancing them right now. But it is tough measuring this behaviour. So it does vary. As I mentioned with the preschool, it's complicated by, we don't perhaps have a strong grasp of exactly the right number, but I do think it does show that there's a sizable percentage of children who need support with their activity behaviour. I mentioned that, of course, there's a multitude of factors that influence physical activity behaviour. We just can't think about self-help or thinking about positives and getting a better attitude or whatever. We need to do that, but we need to do this in an environment that supports and enhances our physical activity behaviours. Parents are a really important ingredient in this puzzle, or part of the puzzle. And some of the things that we should advocate for is good physical education, walking and biking to school, as well as things like getting activity breaks in the day. We're tight for time, otherwise I'd make you do a few steps up and down. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. I'm now going to hand it off to Hayley, who's going to really now talk about built environments and how it influences physical activity.
Thank you, Stuart. So Stuart's given us a good overview at a national level how we're going in terms of kids' physical activity. Well, what did WA children get on their physical activity report card? Well, it's no different. We're kind of sitting down there on the D level. This is data from the CAPAN study. It's a little bit older now, but you can see in primary school-aged boys, around 60% are doing that 60 minutes or more of physical activity a day. Just over 70% of primary school-aged girls are achieving that 60 minutes or more a day. Similar levels for the boys when they get to secondary school, but what's alarming when you look at this is, the majority, 90% of secondary school-aged girls are not getting 60 minutes of physical activity or more a day. And what's driving this? Well, it's a lot to do with how we spend our leisure time these days. It's a lot more screen-based, that technology is aiding our sedentary lifestyles, and we can see it across the generations. You know, these shots of families, you know, some might be slightly set up shots, but you can see even Nan's involved there with whatever gear she's got there and has that. But yeah, it's happening across the generations. So data again from Western Australia, we can see across the primary and secondary school age groups, boys and girls, around 70 to 80% are spending more than the recommended 2 hours a day in front of screens. And this is happening earlier and earlier. There's babes there, but you know, I'm a parent. I have a 4-year-old and almost 7-year-old, and you know, I question myself: am I using screens sometimes to entertain my kids, possibly babysit them at the expense of interacting with them and playing with them, or allowing them time to play together or have independent playtime? Why is that important? Well, this is a kid's job. That's their job. We go to work each day. A child plays. In fact, you know, the UN Convention on Rights of the Child says it is a child's right to play. Play is so important for a child's brain, social, language, physical development. It facilitates social interaction and a lot of things that Stuart's just talked about in relation to physical activity. But importantly, the outdoor play are even more important in terms of physical activity, preventing issues related to overweight and obesity, but also in allowing kids to be creative. It's how they can explore and have opportunities for things like imaginative play. So how does this all relate to the built environment? Well, where you live matters. The proximity of your house to your town centres or your city, where you work, your proximity to bus and train stops, the social mix of the community, the provision of public amenities like public open space or parks, health clinics, schools, childcare, can critically impact individuals' well-being. And what we see is if we're creating these supportive environments, there's lots of advantages in terms of health and wellbeing. And this is the research that we do at the Centre for the Built Environment and Health at UWA. You know, our job is about doing policy-relevant research, and it's about informing and influencing planning and policies that relates to urban design, because our goal is all about creating healthy and sustainable communities across the life course. Some of the features of the built environment. I've put this up here because the built environment is many things, and quite often it doesn't work in isolation. So some of the themes that bring it together relate to walkability and cyclability. So when you walk out your door, the ability to walk around your neighbourhood safely and enjoy it. We now have terms that extend a little further than, say, the physical activity and refer to the livability of your neighbourhood. Traffic, obviously an important feature of the built environment, particularly as it relates to children. Destinations relates to a whole host of things that are in our neighbourhood or possibly not. They're your schools, your childcare, your shops, your services, your health clinics, what have you. Greenness is your access to parks, but it can be also about the greenness of your street. So maybe how many trees or the lack of trees that may line your street. On the far left here corner, street connectivity is how connected your neighbourhood is. So we find at two extremes. We have well-connected grid-like street patterns that are easy to navigate and encourage more walking and cycling. And I'll mention this a bit later in relation to children, but at the other extreme we have low street connectivity. This is where we get a more curvy, linear, cul-de-sac kind of neighbourhoods. Residential density, so Perth is a very low density place, a lot like many places in the US. But then we have other extremes like, you know, places like Hong Kong. And we're certainly moving in WA with changes in our population growth and kind of limits on our urban boundaries to be moving to slightly higher densities, but still on an international level we're low density. Crime is an important feature of the built environment. And lastly, aesthetics. It's a term, but basically how nice your neighbourhood is, how attractive it is when you walk out. All right, so what I'm going to do now is take you through some of these features of the built environment, how they influence kids' health. This here is just to highlight that features of the neighbourhood can either enable health and well-being or they can be barriers to our health and well-being. And there's probably some mixed where you've got neighbourhoods where you've got some good things working to support health and well-being, but cancelling out with some negative impacts as well. All right, so what I'm going to ask the audience to do now is have a little think about how you travelled to and from school when you were a child. So what I'd ask you to do, we're also going to combine this with a break in our extended sitting time tonight, because it is a bit of a long run, and I've been on the run today, but I've been a lot of sitting as well. So I'd like you to stand up, the audience to stand up. If you walked, only if, you get rewarded here, if you walked and cycled to school as a child on most days of the week. Well, that's looking pretty impressive. Okay. I'd like you to stay standing if your children, particularly if you have primary, high school age children, also walk and cycle to school on most days of the week. Do or did, yeah. Depends on the age and what have you. Okay, we lost over half. Okay, so you can just see, you can sit down if you'd like, you can keep stretching, feel free to go off to the side and stretch if you'd like, but you can see in just one generation how those levels of walking and cycling to school have changed. And we can see that there's been a rapid decline. There's a lot of evidence to show over the last 3 decades, the rapid decline in kids walking and cycling to school. And why is that? Well, it's obvious. There's been this increase in mum's taxi, and I'm one of them. And really what this means is it's a huge potential loss of everyday physical activity pretty much wiped out from kids' lives. What are we seeing kids in WA? Well, around 60% of them are being driven to and from school each day. What I'd like to share with you now is some work from my colleague, Gina Trapp. She's here in the audience. This was from the TREX study. It's really neat. It looks a little like there's a lot going here, but I'm going to walk you through it. The green is the walking, the blue's the cycling to school, and the red's the driving. So at the top, we've got what the boys actually did, what they said they did, and how they got to school. So you can see most of them there are nearly 50% are being driven to school. We actually asked, we as in Gina and the track team, what they preferred to do. You can see almost 60% preferred and wanted to cycle to school. Move down to the girls, again, what they actually did, over 50% are being driven to school, but when they asked what their preference was as how they got to school, over 50% wanted to walk, so there's a gender difference there, but still 34% of girls said they would prefer to cycle to school. So big differences in what kids are doing now and what they'd actually prefer to do. What I'm going to do now is, if you haven't seen this, and there's probably lots of you that have, this is a tiny little clip from the Life at 9 series. This is fantastic, and I'm not just preaching it because my supervisor at Telethon Kids, Steve Zubrick, is part of the team, but it really nicely, in a very small minute or so, shows some of the issues related to walking and cycling to school. The series, A Life at 9, is on now. It's tracked a longitudinal study of Australian children from birth through. You can get the different series as they go.
Part of the reason so few Australian children walk to school is that so many attend schools outside their local area. For Anastasia, it's only a short walk of 100 metres, but she's still not allowed to go on her own.
I really wish I could have more independence, so you don't have to be told where to go and what to do.
Here's your hand. Safe to cross. I think Anastasia's getting close to being ready to walk to school on her own, but I suppose it's one of those things that as a parent, as a protector, you still want to make sure that they're safe. All right, see you, sweetheart.
Bye-bye.
Don't forget your notes.
I won't.
And be good.
I think a lot of us as parents experience some of those issues walking and cycling to school. So what can we do to encourage more walking and cycling to school? So from a built environment perspective, this is some of Gina's work as well and the track team, but really it's about providing areas where there's lower levels of traffic and safe crossings. That's kind of obvious. But if we have streets around schools that are more highly connected, we reduce the distance between home and school, which is a big factor in getting kids and parents to allow their kids to walk and cycle to school. And this diagram, I think, shows it quite well. So on the left, you've got the purple bit in the middle is the house of the child. You've got this more curvilinear cul-de-sac kind of neighbourhood. You can see the red line. In fact, they've even flipped out onto the next neighbourhood there. They've had to walk so far to get to school. What is important here is the long distance, but on the top there, I can get my little Here, this is a major road, so these children are being exposed to quite a lot of traffic up here, which is not a good thing. If you go on the right there to the more connected grid-like street network, you can see much shorter distance that the kids are having to travel to school. It's a more direct route, and they're not being exposed to those high levels of traffic as well. So issues about where we put our schools and the street network and the safety and the traffic aspects. Of course, there's a lot of programs and initiatives that have been done and have been rolled out related to encouraging more walking and cycling to school. You've probably all seen the walking school bus that's had success. We're finding in our generation of kids now they need some confidence and ability to cycle, so education classes on cycling. I mean, kind of for me it was a rite of passage to ride a bike, but you know, that's what we're finding helps, and also some new initiatives around kiss and leave to reduce the amount of congestion around those drop zones at schools. So we find by improving the walking and cycling infrastructure and protecting our kids from traffic, we're definitely helping with our own parents' concerns, but the parent education is also important. And I think just by being here tonight, that's a really good step, but I will refer to that a little bit later on in the presentation again. All right, so another setting beyond the school that's really important, particularly for our younger years, is the preschool environment. And I think Donna mentioned that we're doing some pilot work around this, really to understand how the physical environment, both outdoors and indoors, and a more kind of smaller micro environment, influences kids' activity and their general health and well-being. So on the bottom right there, you've got an example of some outdoor spaces that are a bit more nature orientated. You've got gardens here, you've got pathways that all connect up for cycling and pushing things along. They don't kind of just end and that's it. And then kind of you've got some other examples up here where you've got, you know, the AstroTurf and the kind of play equipment. It's nicely coloured but not very interesting. So we're looking at the moment how these physical environments, both outdoors and indoors, affect kids' health and well-being, and I kind of stay tuned to that space. All right, I'm going to move back to the neighbourhood now and move to the slightly older children. And this is a really good example of how kids' mobility, or their right to roam in their neighbourhood has changed over a number of generations. It's from an article in the UK, and it's followed the same family over 4 generations and looked at how their roaming circles changed. So you've got great-granddad George, who in 1919 was allowed to walk 10 k's to go fishing at this spot, unsupervised, so without an adult. Move down a generation, you've got Granddad Jack, who in 1950, these are all about the same age, so about at 8 years old, he was allowed to go about, I think it was about 1.6 k's to go play in the woods. These are in miles, I think, so we're converting them. Next generation down, we have the mum Vicky, about 8 years old in 1979. She was allowed to go about 800 metres, I think, to the local pool. And then you take the current generation, which is Ed, 2007, again about 8 years old, and he was allowed to walk 270 metres to the end of his street without an adult, without his mum or dad there. So masses of changes in kids' independent mobility in that time. It does have significant impact on children's health and development. Independent mobility and that process of developing independence is really important for children. It's not just their physical activity, but it's how they socially interact with their friends in the community. It's how they learn to navigate their community and take risks in a safe kind of environment, how they learn how to navigate traffic, important skills to have. All right, WA data, it kind of tells the same story. So this is again some data from the TREX study. My colleague Karen Villanueva, who's now at the Uni of Melbourne, but this shows you in 10 to 12-year-olds, which, you know, if they're a little bit older and we're expecting them to have some fair amount of independent mobility, particularly in the local neighbourhood, 30% have absolutely none. So their parents would not allow them to be actively travelling without an adult to any local destinations or activities. We've got around 60% with a little, so they're allowed to go up to 3 places in their local environment. But the message is the levels of independent mobility are pretty low in an age group where we're expecting them, or we're thinking that they should be developing this skill and doing a lot more. What affects children's independent mobility and independence? Well, in terms of the built environment, it's similar things as I mentioned to do with walking and cycling. It's connected streets, safe from traffic, but it's also about having somewhere to go that's relevant for different age groups of kids, so having access to parks, and we were talking today, different features in parks are important for different age groups of kids, so a playground may be more important to a younger child, but basketball hoop, skate park area may be more important for older children, shops, friends' houses and schools. All right, so I think one of the biggest concerns for parents and how this all relates to the built environment comes to do with safety. So this was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald where a parent was lectured by the police and potentially reported to the Department of Community Services because the father said, my boy's quite mature for his age, he wanted independence, so he asked to go to the local shop, and the shop was around 400 metres away and on a familiar route. The father says, the police brought him home, they then lectured me on the fact that he was too young to be out by himself. So you know, as parents, there's a lot of pressure. We're trying to do the right thing, but at a community level, there's also social pressures and concerns about safety, and it's a really hard balance to strike. As parents, we worry a lot, particularly about stranger danger. But when we look at the reality of statistics beyond our own parents and parental fear, we can see that the probability of a child actually being, which is not a great thing, but the probability of a child being murdered by a stranger is less than 3 in a million, but the probability of being killed by a car is much higher at 200 in a million. There's been no significant increase of sexual assaults against children or child abductions by strangers, but over the last 30 years, particularly in Australia, our own fears about stranger danger as parents has increased significantly. So really the reality of being harmed by a stranger doesn't line up with our own fears. What has it led to? Well, you've all seen these ones before, but the terms the bubble wrap generation, cotton wool kids are really being used to describe our current generation. So as parents and a community, do we focus so much and feel pressured to focus on children's safety and security with some unintended consequences that are negatively impacting on their physical, social, emotional and health and development? And thanks, Lauren. Again, a little snippet from Life at 9, which I think will bring this little bit of my talk together about how this influence of the built environment works.
We've mounted a camera on them so they can film their own adventure.
Mama, look bad.
Our kids will try to make it to the local shop without adults and buy an ice block.
Don't lose $20. See ya.
See ya.
Given that none of them are actually allowed to do this alone, we promised the parents that the film crew would supervise at a safe distance.
Probably walking. Where I feel comfortable.
This is as much a test of the child-friendliness of the neighbourhood as it is of the kids' independence. The streets must be considered safe enough to cross.
That's the shop there, but we're not allowed to cross the road. Whoa, there's too much traffic.
Their house must be close enough to a corner shop.
I used to go down there with Nana Poppy, but I can't do that anymore because it's shut.
And each child must be confident enough to get the job done.
We're nearly going to stop. Yeah, get to the pole, because I'm worried.
So far, this foray into independence has been impossible for all but 2 of our kids. The rest have been stumped by fear, traffic, and the lack of a corner shop. It seems the changing nature of our neighbourhoods means fewer of our kids are learning the everyday tasks of life.
Thank you. Would you like to go for chocolates? 2 for $3.50? Oh, dear. Thank you.
And interestingly, the child who has expressed most fear about being alone is still going strong.
A child who walks to the corner shop or goes to the bus on her own, they get that sense of resilience, of responsibility, of being able to cope on their own. And they're going to get a lot more self-esteem and confidence from that.
Thank you.
This has been a big achievement for Daniel. And Mum Kath is acutely aware of how important steps like these are for Daniel's confidence.
I think he wants to feel that he's got that responsibility, that he's got that, sense of ownership. That's his way of, you know, showing that he's being responsible.
Dad?
All right, so what I've talked about up till now is really about how changes in the built environment impacting our kids now. What happens and what changes in the built environment will happen in the future and impact our kids' kids. So some of the issues that we're dealing with relate to by population groups. So by 2050, the Australian population is projected to double, with cities such as Perth growing faster than others. We're going to have changes in our residential density, which has impacts. We go from that sprawl, a little bit higher density. We've certainly seen changes previously, and there'll be more impact when we look at trends towards larger houses on smaller blocks. We're losing that backyard, which is a traditional place for where our kids play. We're also seeing the trends in how our yards are designed and landscaped. They're generally more adult-orientated spaces for entertaining and relaxing rather than inviting outdoor space for kids' play and exploration. Less space outdoors, less exciting spaces outdoor, possibly means more time indoors in front of screens at the expense of that activity, having some impact then on kids' health and well-being. We're also seeing what's important in the future in terms of changes to our built environment here in Perth will be as we increase in our residential density, we have changes in our backyard spaces, it's going to put more pressure on our public open space. So our green spaces, our parks, our playgrounds, access to nature is going to become even more important. We find, as you can see, there are lots of evidence to show that access to these kinds of green space is important for all aspects of kids' physical activity and health and development. And what we find, particularly in relation to more natural environments, the types of play that's encouraged or facilitated in those settings, it tends to be more diverse and imaginative and creative. So it's not just about the green space and a playground, it's the nature as well. In fact, just quickly to finish off, this is some data from our centre. This comes out of the public open space tool that's been developed. And this was showing that children who had access to a playground within a park, walking distance from home, so about 400 metres. So in the highest local government authority, there was about 54% of kids that had access, and the lowest level of access was 6%. Big variation in between. But this is just one aspect of green space. We actually look at nature and we see totally different stories. So some of those local government authorities that don't have as much access to playgrounds and parks are doing really well in access to nature and bush, and we probably need to do a little bit more to encourage that. Why? Well, this is data from colleague Lisa Wood here and Karen Martin, the Child's Play study. This is what kids prefer. They prefer more natural features, trees, rocks and water. What kinds of activities do they like doing? Well, it's the climbing, the hide and seek and the imaginary play, and it's all these nature kind of features that facilitate these kinds of activities better. All right, to sum up, what can we do? As parents, as a community, at level of that planning and policy, particularly as it relates to the built environment, and as researchers? Well, I think we all need to be working towards a common goal. I think we need to provide the same opportunities we had to grow and develop into healthy adults and participate in economic, social and a civic life. We need to be working towards providing the same opportunity for our kids now and into the future. I think it's something along the lines of better supporting children's health and wellbeing by creating more livable, compact, pedestrian-friendly, less car-dependent and more socially inclusive cities. We want everything and we want it perfect, but I think it's a good model to be aiming towards. We all need to be advocates, we all need to be role models, and we need to work across a whole lot of levels because we need to be putting play back into childhood. So I'm going to finish there and pass the baton to Jeff. He's going to, I think, highlight some more issues, broader issues to do with the built environment and kids' health, and hopefully sum it all up and give you with a nice, finish with a nice take-home message. No pressure. Thanks, Jeff. Flashing.
Thanks, Hayley. I'll say a couple of introductory things, but I just want to plant one thought because we're going to do one more activity, keep you in the spirit, which is to, I'd just like you to not think too hard about it, but just recall a favourite childhood memory of your own as a child. So yeah, we're going to get onto that very soon, but thank you very much to be part of this forum and join with Stuart and Hayley in thanking you for the opportunity to be part of it. I've come to Perth reasonably often over the years, but and had a lot of fondness for the Telethon Institute, as anyone does working with children's wellbeing issues around the country. And in the last few years had a fair bit to do with Fiona Stanley, which has been quite a treasure in my life to have been involved with her with an initiative that we've been trying to get off the ground for a couple of years now called the Australian National Development Index, a whole national set of community wellbeing measures for Australia. But that's another issue. Let's start with that activity. I'm going to be like Hayley and ask you to all stand up, and we'll get going again with a sitting down message. I want you to sit down if you've got that favourite childhood memory in your mind. Sit down if it was wherever it was happening, and what you can recall of it. If it was inside, was it inside? No. Okay, sit down if that favourite childhood memory had adults involved. Sit down then if it was a time-limited activity, that is, it had a very formal starting point and ending point, however long it went for. Point proven. Anyway, you can sit down and stretch again. You know, we did that exercise. I'm hardly alone. Other people do it too. I'm sure some people in this room do it. It's quite a common thing to do, particularly with a group of parents, and particularly if you're talking about the kind of issues we are today. I know the most interesting thing, though, in the exercise, other than that it's such a universal response no matter where you go in the country, in fact around the world in many respects, you know, that all have those traits that were just mentioned, adult-free, not, you know, time-limited and outdoors. But what's really interesting is if then you ask the further question, I won't of you today in interest of time again, but if you ask the extension of that question, which is in this exercise in 30 years, how many of you think your children will be having the same responses? It's about 50-50, I find, which is still optimistic. A lot of people still hoping those ambitions Hayley finished with are there, but a lot of people also dealing with a bit of the reality. So, look, I was going to deal with some of that too, but in the context of taking the issue about the impact of the built environment on children's lives and built and natural environments on children's lives to the community-wide level, I suppose, and particularly this issue of working on a whole of community basis, particularly the initiative Child Friendly Cities, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but it comes always, I think, to acknowledge historically with what has been across the disciplines a resurgence in interest in the lives of children and an increasing recognition of those interdependencies, as you've heard tonight, between all the different disciplines and their influence on children's well-being. And I'm not going to give a large historical background, but we should acknowledge that really children were largely absent from our understanding of cities around the world for a long time, and particularly it only really took up probably in the post-war era when we were still seeing grinding poverty more in our inner cities. Of course, that's changed with the post-industrialised world, but in our inner cities, where children noticeably became, and their families became a victim, I guess, of that poverty, and it couldn't sort of be ignored any longer, particularly in some of the bigger Western cities, but also, of course, in the rapidly growing developing cities of the world. In fact, that was the trigger for the slide you've got up there at the moment for that trigger around that kind of grinding inner city poverty in developing big cities, developing countries' big cities, for the UNICEF Child Friendly Cities initiative, which is that mid slide there, and the partnerships to create child-friendly cities. UNICEF launched it in the late 70s, and it's endured as a quite significant, I think, initiative that UNICEF continue to lead around the world. It hasn't had the courage, just to cut to the chase, in terms of this country as it might have. It's been promoted quite as a kind of a accreditation tool, particularly for local governments, to become a child-friendly city. And it says a lot that in this country there's really only one city that's gone the whole way down the path, Bendigo in Victoria, to be a child-friendly city, but it's been sold very much on the grounds of it being an accredited thing, that an allure for cities. And that's despite a lot of the building blocks. I'll just go on to that slide, which are really important in a child-friendly city. And just to outline how comprehensive some of those things are, you know, you can see them. I won't go through them one by one, but really is, you know, all those steps I think are absolutely vital in creating a child-friendly city. The more significant work, back on the previous slide though, is to acknowledge in practice that's happened in terms of thinking about children in our communities. Have actually been some bigger, larger funded government initiatives, and the one in particular that I'm highlighting there, Communities for Children, that's the offshoot of it in South Australia, but it still flies under the radar, interestingly, for a massive federal government investment that happened actually in the last years of the Howard government, continued through the Labor government, and has actually, despite all the other cuts in the last federal budget, been refunded for another 5 years in about 35 to 40 communities. And when I say communities, you know, large numbers of suburbs in a cluster, if you like, but in disadvantaged areas, primarily across Australia, regional and urban, funded with some block funding for a period of years, basically for that community to decide through a facilitating partner how it best be spent to improve children's well-being. And I mean, when I say significant, I mean, we're talking cumulatively hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions really that have been spent on it. So here's some really significant work that's gone on and probably hasn't been evaluated and assessed as it best might have. It's been evaluated and assessed once and really didn't come up with a whole lot more other than that it was worth keeping on doing. But we know through that work how significant place is in the lives of children. I'm going to just go through a couple of things, and some of them will be, in a sense, reflections and responses to what Stuart and Hayley have already talked about. The one I just wanted to put here in that slide around perception of risk, and I'll always use this slide now, it's getting a little dated in terms of its time, but Hayley's, I think, already mentioned the name of Tim Gill, who's a very well-known person in this area, has been a regular visitor, I know, to Perth and other parts of Australia. Used to be the head of Play England, a tremendous advocacy organisation for play across the UK, until it got cut in the change of government in the UK. But he continues himself, of course, to be such a massive advocate for play, and that was probably his best known book and work that he did. If you've been listening while I've been rambling on to or reading, sorry, while I've been rambling on to the bit on the right, the column, I put that up because I actually think that says a lot, much as I might object. I don't know who that columnist is. I put it up there because he's from the Herald Sun. He's a male from the Herald Sun, which most of you know is considered sort of more on the right in terms of media things. But it's less about that. It's actually the punchline, which is the second last sentence, which is, whilst there's the Daniel Morecambe stories and Madeleine McCann's, there'll always be that perception of risk that overrides what rationally statistics tell us is flatlining, in some cases decreasing in terms of incidents. And I can tell you firsthand, going up and talk about encouraging independent mobility amongst children on the Sunshine Coast, where the Daniel Morecambe incident, and of course we've had the very big court case that's followed, go and talk about that up there and you don't get a lot of carriage. So it's not to say that we should be talking about and promoting it, but also to acknowledge we've got to have, I think, a public debate about this which can come to the middle. And my sense is, from talking often about this and up with parents, is a lot of people do sit around the middle. They're wrestling with it, and yet we have, like a lot of issues, I think, in Australia, this perception that it's all out on the extremes. It's either, you know, people wanting their kids to run around communities naked and feral, or you know, wrapping them up literally in bubble wrap, and of course most of us are sitting a lot more in the middle. And more we can have a debate that reflects that, I think, the better. Maybe a little bit after today. Life at 9, the videos you saw came very much out of a tremendous and one of the best investments government's ever made in terms of research and evidence in the longitudinal study of Australian children. Close behind it, I think, in terms of value, and it's still to be determined how much. But again, a thing that's probably flown under the radar, at least publicly a bit, is, except if your children have been involved in it, is the Australian Early Development Index, now called the Australian Early Development Census, Just for those in the audience who may not be aware, just very quickly, it was borrowed from the Canadians, but a tool that's teacher assessed, but in children's first year of schooling, that we've now had 2 waves of, 2009, 2012 in Australia. The second wave capturing 99% of children in their first year of schooling. So the best population measure we've ever got of how kids are going, albeit at one age group, but telling us a huge amount, particularly again, with our interests here tonight in relation to the built environment. This is a study that I've been very fortunate to become involved in, and this is not to dazzle you with science here with this. This is just a pretty typical scatter graph around that depicts mostly communities sitting on the average in terms of how they're going with that Australian Early Development Index in relation to their socioeconomic status. The graph, the axis on below. So most communities sitting on diagonal, that is on the average. The real interest, and it's sort of the interest you can even say at parties and people would, won't yawn, is that you can actually talk about, which is fundamentally interesting, I think, is why is some community close by to another community doing so much better? That is, in terms of this instrument, why are kids so less vulnerable on the Australian Early Development Index, and yet their socioeconomic profile is quite low, there's low incomes. What's going on in that community? That's fundamentally interesting, I think, to most people, particularly if they're living in those communities themselves. So I'm fortunate to be part of a study that's looking at about 20 of those communities across Australia. Unfortunately, none in Western Australia, although maybe that'll change over the course of the research. But that's going to tell us some really interesting things about how children are impacted by lots of things around them, including their own neighbourhood. But at the moment, these are the domains that the Australian Early Development Index uses. On the right side, you can see, and they show a pretty linear relationship between vulnerability in terms of the least disadvantaged, most disadvantaged. The more disadvantaged, the more the vulnerability, as you can see. Another one that's another bit of a, I won't say sacred cow, but in a territory we don't go down much, and I noticed Stuart and Haley both had some slides that pointed to gender differences but didn't make much of them, but because there mightn't be much to be made of in those respects. But there is a huge difference, we know, again, mostly intuitively, between how boys and girls react to the built environment. The most powerful example I can give of that, I thought I had a slide in there, must have dropped it out. It's a very powerful slide, and I wish I hadn't dropped it out, but what it shows you is an installation using all white Lego in our wonderful Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane that overlooks the river, that overlooks to the CBD. And in the opening of the Gallery of Modern Art, I went there with my own kids, so I'm telling it firsthand. So if you can imagine a whole lot of white Lego on this huge table, and it was so popular, it was the whole Goma opening had so many people, but that particular one was so popular with kids, they had to put a 10-minute limit on it. But you can just, I'll teach you, I'm not exaggerating, this is exactly what happened. Everyone turned up, and they brought their kids in, and they all lined up a bit like at school in boys and girls lines. And the boys all went off to the right, and it was just, they all went off and they all started building what they were looking at over the cityscape, all these massive skyscrapers. And some were getting their dads to come and lift them up so they could make it even bigger than the one beside them. It's no joke, again, not exaggerating. The girls kind of went in there. Some of them had a minute, maybe a little bit longer, but most of them were looking across at the boys. They were bored. It was only one colour, they pushed it away, they made a couple of things, and then most of them just dribbled away and went on. That's exactly how it played out. So it was really interesting. I'm not an essentialist around gender at all, but that couldn't be denied, and I've got sons and daughters, and I know there's big differences there, but yeah, pretty much testament to differences around the built environment when you see that. Interestingly, the slide I did have was actually the year after, when the same installation artist from Scandinavia came back with his white Lego. They had it in the downstairs part of the Gallery of Modern Art without that view over to the city, and it was far more mixed. And boys came and did far more different things, still with white Lego, but they all did different sort of stuff without this viewscape to look over. So really interesting. And another issue culturally in our whole urban studies field, we talked about higher density, but we've still got in this country a pervasive snobbery about our middle and outer suburban thing, and I'm not out to bat for them any more than I am for anyone else I kind of discriminated against. But I think we've got a sort of unashamed in this country beat up of what we think goes on in middle hour suburbia, again without a lot of evidence to back it up. Here's a classic example from America on the left. You know, the title says it all, and he does, to his credit, I suppose, to build up a whole little evidence base that shows a lot of outer suburban America is fatter and sicker and stuff. But you know, there's some pretty long-held reasons for that, and I might say a bit more about it. But the one on the right, which was kind of the equivalent, it was a bit much to bear, because if you know Elizabeth Farrelly, she's the architect design writer for the Sydney Morning Herald, and she's written about exactly the same thing about McMansions and so forth and outer suburbia. And I don't know exactly where Elizabeth Farrelly lives, but I don't think she would have strayed a kilometre or two from the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you know, live. So, I mean, she's got a book on Blubberland that's a little bit rich to take. So there is this sort of unashamed beat up of what we think of outer suburbia and going on. And those studies, like I say, that have bothered to go and do them show you know, much more nuanced and complex patterns. Great colleagues over at Barbara Pocock's Centre for Work and Life in South Australia that looked at 10 outer suburban communities across Australia that showed, you know, lots of different aspects of that. The one I'm highlighting here is particularly how significant in terms of for young people rather than children so much, but for teenagers, how marginalised they feel in those communities, particularly often exacerbated by the fact that those communities have so much, when I'm talking about greenfield communities, so much provided for young children, because that's such a big demographic, and yet teenage years they don't feel part of it. I talked about those cultural differences. I talked about there's another reflection of that is a terrific group in London that now do this all over the world, that use recycled cardboard and take it to festivals. This is they took it to a great arts festival we have in Brisbane called Out of the Box for 3 to 8-year-olds every 2 years, and you know, kids were invited to come and use all this recycled thing. Again, it's remarkable how much kids reflect their thing. I mean, in Brisbane, it was all the kids had this little CBD with their cardboard, and then they had all this low-density suburbia. That's just what they just built what they know. And Singapore, they're all building big skyscrapers and greenery, yeah. So we mimic what we think. One other, just again, reflection on some stuff you've already heard. So Hayley showed the slide of the disappearing Australian backyard. It was actually done by a fellow that was at our centre for a number of years at Griffith University's Urban Research Program, a visiting English mayor, who was just stunned when he came to Australia that this land of the great backyard, where are they all gone, and particularly in their new houses. But it was a real learning experience for him. He sort of looked at it on pretty sort of traditional planning lines, and then he started to have all this social science, including some stuff I thrust in front of him that, why was it so? And he was genuinely asking. And one of the answers that I think doesn't get enough, again, attention is just, many people may already know this, but I don't think a lot of people highlight it enough, which is we've been top of the working hours for OECD countries for a long time and show no signs of dropping below it. And while we have still in this country this obsession with increasing productivity, which often equates to we just got to keep working more hours, I can't see how that'd change. So if you've got huge dual parent working hours, particularly in those places that have disappearing backyards, the obvious outcome is, why do you need it? Why would you ever want a backyard or need a backyard? You're not using it, and you're only using it for entertaining on weekends. So it's not to let them off the hook for that, but the reality is people are just going to economically maximise their properties by putting more house on it. And this Tony Hall could never kind of get his head around that, but I think that's a fundamental truth behind it. There's other great stuff going on. Colleague Deb Langridge from Nature Play WA and I were part of some work in the Illawarra for a few years on Child Friendly by Design, actually getting kids much more actively involved in the physical design of their communities. with the kind of aspirations that Hayley and Stuart have already spoken about. Interestingly, that was a Communities for Children I spoke about earlier, Communities for Children funded project. We, from the best of our reckoning, don't think there was not just a project called Child Friendly by Design, we don't think there were any other Communities for Children funded projects across Australia for the 10 years it's already been going and another 5 to go that actually were focused on the physical built environment in any of those projects. So that tells you a little bit about, still we've got a long way to go. And then within schools, Stuart's already talked about it, but I've got a master's student that's wanting to upgrade to a PhD at the moment, part-time, a mature age student who's previously been a principal and a teacher at many schools. And her thesis is that so many of them are child unfriendly. So we can do a lot more in that case about doing an eco-design house at schools. Across strategy, we've got plenty of good stuff happening across, I mentioned Bendigo before, but there's lots of good citywide, child-friendly city strategies emerging in Australia that haven't necessarily needed the UNICEF project as a guide. They just themselves known how important it is, and particularly data behind it. And Bendigo championed this issue, but you can actually really invigorate a community with good data about how it's going in front of it. With, in their case, they called it the State of Children's Report, this one there on the right. And out of it, they started this whole issue of data parties, which kind of sounds a bit naff, but it actually worked, you know, that you can get, you know, prick a certain issue that people are really interested. But ultimately, we've got to, I think, in all this, come back to a systems approach, not trying to make it too complex, but that we're all got to be all in it together, and that's, I think, pretty reflective of all this place-based work around the country, that it still has to involve all those systems of change. The best example I've seen of it, more second-hand than first-hand, up in the Blue Mountains. I think it's a terrific initiative, the Stronger Families Alliance, with their child and family plan that they really work to. And we are trying to do this nationally now through the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth that Fiona Stanley was the originator of, still going today, some 10 years later. I'm the state convener for it in Queensland. And it's put all its eggs literally in the basket called the Nest, branding it as the first national strategy for children's wellbeing that we've had, and I think a good thing, and one that we should all be trying to get behind. And I'll finish with other people have this as their favourite quote too, but I really love it from the Afro-American poet James Baldwin, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So I guess it's facing those realities of what's going on in our communities as we try to make them more child-friendly. Thanks, Donna.
I think we've had just a wonderful summary. In fact, as I was sitting there trying to think, how do I pull this together as a mum and auntie and all the young people that I'm in contact with, is when you think about what Stuart said, you know, there's obviously clear guidelines. So as a parent, I know now roughly how much time I need to make my children, encourage my children to be active. I know that the built environment has a really strong influence on it, and of course as a parent I could sit back and wait for my local council to make my environment in my community more friendly, or I could build my own environment in my own home or in the immediate areas into places that I can take my children. And of course, finishing with Jeff making comments about, you know, the importance of young people's voice and ensuring that we're talking to our children about what should our backyard look like and involving them in the decision making. So it's easy, again, to wait for communities to do it for us, but I think as parents we can be very proactive in the ways that we might address that. Can I thank the speakers again for a wonderful evening, and thank you all, and wish you a safe trip home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.